Hello, this is Anton Bayer and Matt Marmstein, and we're doing today's podcast on this weekly brief. And the weekly brief is titled the what is it?
After the storm.
After the storm. There we go. I can't.
You
It's
were
been
dealing
that
with the
long.
storm so much, so
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
tired. So
There you go. Yeah.
yeah,
So after the storm, there we go.
that's right.
And so we've seen some pretty remarkable weather patterns these last couple of years, Matt. And I'll jump
Mhm.
ahead, but just last year's summer, I remember seeing in Roseville temps at 110, 115. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, you sure do. In fact, last year, for example, we had a stretch all the way in September of 110 plus degrees, 5 days in a row. Couldn't believe it.
Wow. Wow.
Um, yeah, luckily we had a little water last year. The year before we were almost bone dry.
Right.
And I remember that well because we finally decided to buy a boat, and what do you know? There's no water.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was
If
pretty
you want to
funny.
guarantee a drought, buy a boat. And if you want it
Yeah,
to rain, schedule a golf tournament. For sure.
exactly. Yep,
Yeah.
so true. But
Yeah.
then now
Well, we
you just went through a crazy event out there. Yeah,
Yeah,
tell
two
us about
two
that.
crazy events. We moved out
Yeah.
here in 2021, and no sooner did we move in January that February 14th, Valentine's Day, we had 12 inches of snow that came down in the following 4 to 5 days. And what
Wow.
really made it fun is that we had 10 family members that came in that early Friday for what was going to be a 4-day weekend that turned into a 10-day weekend because all the airports were closed with 12 inches of snow, 9-degree weathers, roads were frozen, and pretty much all of San Antonio was at a complete stop. And
Wow.
so and the challenge was is that fortunately my wife bought food, and fortunately I filled up. I had the propane tanks all filled up because we lost power for most of that time. So we
Wow.
were living off of, and if you lose power, your well doesn't pump water. So we had no water. So we were bucketing water out of the pool. We had wood on from the land for fireplace for the heat. And at night it was like the good old days, candles for the light. And my wife was cooking like crazy woman, making all kinds of food for 12 people. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was quite an experience that ended out okay. And you know what was so funny, Matt, is that by a week later, all the snow
Mhm.
was gone. The weather was in the mid 70s, and it was
That's
like nothing had
fantastic.
ever happened. But the week
Wow.
before, there was literally mile-long lines at the stores to try and get any type of food, anything, water, because the city water was not working. So yeah, you would think that a week later that nothing. If you flew into San Antonio a week later, it would be like, what happened here?
No
But
idea it happened.
yeah, a week before was amazing. And by the way, we have pictures of some of these snowstorms and our property with the snow on our website at www.capitalmgmt if you want to take a look at that. But then, like you were referring to, Matt, last week, many of you read about the ice storms through the Midwest, and the key is that not that it got down to the low temps like 9 degrees. It was really regularly in the high 20s, low 30s, but it was cold enough that the rain in the trees froze. So the freeze and on the trees was so the weight of the water frozen on the tree limbs was so heavy that it literally bent the trees down to the ground. And some
Wow.
of the trees, of course, broke, but many of them didn't. And so there they are. We're almost like bowing down. And I've got a couple of great pictures showing that. But literally bowing down to the ground is the weight of the frozen leaves and branches just brought all that down. And needless to say, you have branches and trees that are laying down because of the rain that we had. It would tip over some trees. Some trees didn't bend over; they actually just blew over.
Ripped him
And
right out of the ground. Wow.
yeah, exactly. And
Wow.
um, and you showed me some of that when I was there a couple weeks ago with all the
Oh
rain
yeah.
that.
Yeah, we ended up having trees into houses, roof leaks everywhere.
Yeah.
It was just, I mean, the tree guys were out in force, as I'm sure they were out where you were too. You know, these guys just, I don't know where they come from, but you know, they're just everywhere, cutting up these trees and removing trees from houses and making a killing. So good for them. But
yeah, if you have a chainsaw, you have a business.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well,
So we've
one of the
experienced a lot of big events recently.
Yeah.
I mean, in the last couple of years, a ton. So tell us more about how that affected us.
Okay, so if we transition from the weather to our economy, and the emphasis here and the caveat is that we're specifically focusing on the U.S. economy, and the reason that we need to emphasize that is that the U.S. has data that we can rely on because the Constitution has stayed the same, the policies of this country have stayed the same, mostly the laws and tax structure has stayed within the same range. So we can refer to a lot of data. Now, this isn't necessarily true in other countries where there's been upheavals and revolutions and constitutions that have been changed or actually never even written. There's many countries that have no constitution in place. But in the US, we do have over 200 years of history that we can look at. And specifically these last 3 years, 2020 to present, with the worldwide pandemic and the pandemic that we had in 2020 and government mandates of businesses being shut down and people sheltered in their house, and then 2021 with the supply chain issues, and then going into 2022, the hyperinflation fears and the Fed's bumping the discount rate 6 times and one more time last week. And so we had a lot that's gone on in these last 3 years, just like very hard weather patterns that have taken place. But looking at history, and this is where it gets interesting, Matt, this isn't the first time that has happened. In fact, much of our asset management, investment management policies is based on first looking at history. What can we learn from history and then take that and apply it as a guideline for today? And so a time period that's very similar to what we're in, and we've referred to it in the past, is 1918 Spanish flu. And that was a time period with the same outbreaks, the same government policies of shutting down businesses and squelching people in their homes, same policy. And what made that also more complicated is that just a few years earlier was the end of World War I. So we had a lot of our military men coming back and personnel coming back to the U.S. And at that time, you know, there was all those issues that were taking place. Now, in our situation, we had, as I mentioned already, the supply chain issues. But what really has compounded and especially exacerbated the inflation issue is all the money the government printed, which was a little different than the 1918 era with the Spanish flu. And with trillions of dollars coming into our economy and a contraction of supply because of supply chain disruption, we have too much money chasing too few goods, and it was a simple formula that led to hyperinflation. And that's where the Feds and smartly stepped in and quickly started bumping rates, and that had a big impact that had residual effects onto the mortgage industry, the housing industry, and a lot of businesses as well. In fact, in December, there were fewer residential sale transactions in 20 years, less than the worst of 2020 and less than the worst of 2008 housing crisis. And then mortgage refinance loans dropped by 90%. So that was a time period that we've been through, and we've seen the same thing. So the question is what happened after the Spanish flu, 1917 and 1919, and of course, before that, World War I? How did things turn out? We don't know our future today, but we can certainly go back and look at their future. And for those of you that study history, know that the 1920s was a remarkable time of recovery and growth. The Dow Jones soared 300%, and in fact, that decade of the 1920s was referred to the Roaring Twenties. It was so outstanding. But it didn't happen right away, Matt. The pandemic ended in 1919, and it wasn't really until mid-1920 that the market really did bottom. So 3 years after the beginning of the Spanish flu, which started in 1917, it was 3 years before the market and the economy really bottomed in the summer of 1920. But from that point forward, the economy and the Dow Jones and the stock market began a very solid recovery. And so it took about 3 years after that. And so here we are in 2023, 3 years after the pandemic started in 2020, and we're starting to see things starting to settle.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I'm curious, are we even almost in a better position, or maybe a better opportunity to have even greater gains than even the 20s, because we're actually coming from a stronger position than then. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I think that would be true. I haven't studied the data of employment during 1919 and 1920, but we do know that unemployment dropped to 3.4% last week, the lowest it's been since 1969. More people working in this country than in the history of this country, and that's because there's more people today than 100 years ago. But yes, and consumers, you and I, and households represent 2/3 of our economy's GDP. So the key is to look at consumers and households. If they're healthy, and if households have income because of employment, then yes, I would say that we are possibly in a much better situation.
Yeah, and it seems the recovery even from 2020 is happening a lot faster. Yes, I know we're in a little bit of a downtrend the last year, but if you compare 2020's low in March to how we performed in 2021, I mean, look at the recovery that a lot of the sectors had.
Yeah,
you know,
why don't you talk about a couple of them?
So, I mean, we had Marriott, Hilton, Expedia, basically travel stocks. They went up 119, 140, and 233% respectively by the end of 2021 from a massive drop. And then, you know,
who even thought hotels would come back?
It wasn't even at the end of the pandemic. The pandemic was still going on, and people were already roaring back when it came to travel. And then, you know, we had food, same thing with restaurants, you know, Ruth's Chris, Chipotle, cheesecake. You know, you have the charts here. If you guys read our brief, I mean, amazing percent gains. And I think that just shows, and back to my comment before, I'm wondering if we're in a better position than we were compared to the 1920s. Yes, history will repeat itself, but maybe we're even in a better position.
Yeah, maybe. And it's worth mentioning that we identified these opportunities in March of 2020. We rebalanced our portfolios and added many of these stocks to our portfolios with outsized returns in just 12, 15 months. So history gave us some good insight as to what to do. And Nyla and I were making calls almost every day, just looking at our portfolios, because in 34 days in 2020, the S&P dropped 34%. I mean, it was a torrid sell-off. And we hit bottom March 23rd, 2020. And that's, you know, that ended up creating not the beginning of the end of the U.S. economy as we know it, but simply terrific buying opportunities, as demonstrated by those returns. So that was quite a bit. So history has shown many times, and that's only one that we're looking at. And possibly, Matt, you're right. Maybe we are in a better position. If we even come close to the roaring 20s of a 300% return in the Dow Jones or the S&P, that would be fantastic.
Sure.
I actually think it'll be more in technology that seeing that type of returns than necessarily the S&P 500. But I think it's very possible the S&P 500 might slowly start building up some speed, just like it did in 1920 to 1921. But it wasn't really until 1924 that the Dow Jones was back above its previous high in 1917. So it actually took 7 years for the Dow Jones to breach its previous high point. We're already above that high point, you know, so that, or at least January of last year, we were above. January 2022, we were above the previous high point, and then we've since dropped down. So yeah, it's very possible that we have better times ahead of us. But I think it's also fair to say that as we're indicating that potentially the worst is over, it's also, I think, fair to say that there may be more issues and a simulation that needs to take place in our economy as a result of these significant events that we've seen. The economy is a lot like a pool of water, and if you throw in a little stone, you're going to have a little ripple. You throw in a big boulder, you're going to have big waves that hit the shore and keep coming to shore. Now, each time they come to shore, they're smaller, and eventually the water smooths out. And the last 3 years have been pretty significant. So to think that water smooth out this quickly, I think would be a little unrealistic. But in reality, the waves are getting smaller, and the around the corner where things are starting to improve is probably closer than what we think.
Makes sense.
Well, good. So we hope that you get in touch with us. Listen and send us comments if you have any questions about these podcasts. Love to hear your comments on our views on this. And we'll be looking at more historical references as to how we might look at 2023. We have a presidential election next year. There's a lot of this data that we can refer to get some indication of where things are going. So that's it for today. Matt and Anton, enjoy talking to you, and you give us a call if you have anything more to say. See you later. Bye.